Poor Dad helped blind woman cross street she saw love for first time in years. It started as one small act of kindness, a weary father with nothing left to give, guiding a blind woman through rushing traffic. But what happened on the other side of that street would change everything. She wasn't just a blind woman, she carried a secret pain and a gift long buried. He wasn't just a poor man, he carried a broken family, barely holding on. Together, they awakened something no one saw coming. But when the shadow of eviction, betrayal, and long-buried family secrets rise, will kindness and faith be enough to save them? Or will love slip away again just when it was finally found? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Hank Peterson adjusted the plastic grocery bags, cutting into his weathered hands. His arthritic fingers ached from the weight, but he kept trudging forward, one careful step at a time. The early autumn chill nipped at his face, reminding him that winter wasn't far off, and with it, higher heating bills he couldn't afford. Just 3 more blocks, he muttered to himself, shifting the bags again. The meager contents barely seemed worth the effort. Some day-old bread from the discount rack, a few cans of soup on sale, and the box of Lucky Charms his grandson Tommy loved so much. Hank had splurged on the cereal, knowing it would bring a smile to the boy's face. These days, Tommy's smiles were precious things, rare as gold. A car horn blared nearby, making Hank flinch. The town was coming alive around him, shop owners unlocking their doors, early morning commuters hurrying to work in shiny cars that made his old pickup truck look like it belonged in a junkyard. He tried not to feel shame about his worn jacket or the holes in his shoes. His late wife Marie had always said dignity came from the inside, not from what you wore. The thought of Marie sent a familiar ache through his chest. 2 years gone, and he still caught himself turning to tell her something, reaching for her hand that wasn't there. She'd always known how to help their daughter Sarah through the rough patches. But now Sarah's depression had deepened since her husband walked out 6 months ago, leaving her and Tommy with nothing but broken promises. Hank paused at the corner to catch his breath, his muscles protesting. Yesterday's yard work for Mrs. Rodriguez had left him stiffer than usual. The extra $20 would help with Tommy's school supplies, though. Every little bit counted when your Social Security check barely covered the rent. Looking down at his calloused hands, Hank remembered how they once operated complex machinery at the factory before the overseas move that left half the town jobless. Now they pulled weeds, painted fences, and fixed whatever needed fixing for whoever could spare a few dollars. It wasn't much, but it kept food on the table and helped maintain what mattered most: his family's dignity. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders heavier than the groceries. Sarah barely left her room some days, except to get Tommy ready for school. The boy needed more than just a roof and meals. He needed hope, stability, the kind of childhood every kid deserved. Hank tried his best to fill the gaps, taking Tommy fishing when he could afford the gas, helping with homework, telling stories about the old days that made the boy laugh. "Morning, Hank," called Fred from the hardware store, sweeping his sidewalk. "Morning," Hank replied with a tired smile. He'd done some painting for Fred last month. The man had offered more money, but Hank only took what they'd agreed on. Pride was sometimes all a man had left. The morning traffic picked up as Hank made his way down Main Street. The familiar storefronts passed by. Mary's Diner, where he occasionally treated Tommy to a chocolate shake, the boarded-up movie theater where he and Marie had their first date, the bank that had turned down his loan application when Sarah needed dental work. Each place held memories, some sweet, some bitter. His arms trembled from the strain of the bags, but he couldn't stop to rest. Sarah would be worried if he took too long, and Tommy needed breakfast before school. The boy had inherited Marie's bright eyes and quick mind. Hank was determined those gifts wouldn't go to waste, no matter what it took. A gust of wind scattered fallen leaves across his path, and Hank pulled his thin jacket closer with his elbow. The smell of wood smoke from somewhere reminded him he needed to check their own heating system before winter. Another expense they couldn't afford, but what choice did he have? He couldn't let Tommy and Sarah freeze. The traffic light ahead turned red, and cars began to pile up at the intersection. That's when Hank noticed her, an elderly woman standing at the corner, her white cane tapping uncertainly at the curb. Her face was turned toward the sound of traffic, lips pressed together in obvious anxiety. She wore a neat blue dress and sensible shoes, but her shoulders were hunched with tension as she gripped her cane. The grocery bag seemed to grow heavier as Hank watched the blind woman's hesitation. The crosswalk signal chirped its walk tone, but she remained frozen in place, clutching her cane as cars rushed past. Hank watched the blind woman for a moment longer, then glanced down at his grocery bags. With a gentle sigh, he shifted them all to one hand, ignoring the bite of plastic handles into his palm. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Would you like some help crossing the street?" The woman turned toward his voice, her face a mixture of surprise and wariness. Up close, Hank could see the fine lines around her mouth, the silver-white hair neatly pinned back. She carried herself with a certain grace, despite her obvious tension. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the white cane. "I don't want to be a bother." "No bother at all," Hank assured her, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm headed this way myself." He didn't mention the grocery bags growing heavier by the second or how his own destination lay in the opposite direction. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his voice. "You're very kind. I'm Clara," she offered, a slight tremor in her words. "Hank Peterson, ma'am. Would you like to take my arm?" He moved closer, careful to telegraph his movements with his voice. "The traffic's pretty heavy this morning." Clara reached out tentatively, her hand finding his sleeve. Her fingers were slim and cool against his worn jacket. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I used to be better at this. Please, just Hank," he said, waiting patiently as she adjusted her grip. "And we all need a helping hand sometimes." The crosswalk signal chirped again, and Hank guided them forward. "The curb is right here, about 2 inches down," he murmured. Clara nodded, testing the step with her cane before descending. As they made their way across, Hank described the path ahead in quiet, steady tones. "We're about halfway now. The pavement's a little uneven here." A car rushed past too close, sending a burst of wind that made Clara flinch closer to him. Hank adjusted his pace to match hers, his arm steady under her grip. "You have a kind way about you," Clara said softly as they walked. "So many people either ignore me entirely or treat me like a child. But you—" She paused, searching for words. "You speak to me like a person." Hank felt heat rise in his cheeks at the compliment. "My mother always said courtesy doesn't cost anything," he replied. The grocery bag swung against his leg, reminding him of their weight, but he kept his voice light. "Your mother was a wise woman." Clara's steps became more confident as they continued. "I used to teach piano, for over 40 years. Had a whole studio of students." Her voice took on a wistful quality. "But that was before I lost my sight." They reached the far curb, and Hank warned her of the step up. "Must have been hard, giving up teaching," he said softly. Clara's face clouded slightly. "I still have my piano, sitting there in my living room, gathering dust. Silly, really. I could still play it. My fingers remember the keys, but somehow—" She shook her head. "I haven't touched it in years." "Music's a precious gift," Hank said, thinking of how Tommy's face lit up whenever he heard someone playing at church. "Seems a shame to let it go unused." Clara's hand tightened slightly on his arm. "When was the last time?" She started, then stopped herself. After a moment, she tried again. "Mr. Peterson, Hank, would you and your grandson like to visit sometime? I could play for you." The words came out in a rush, as if she feared losing her courage. "I heard you mention him earlier," she added quickly. "Your grandson. Something in your voice when you spoke. A grandfather's love carries its own music, you know. Hank looked at her upturned face, saw the mix of hope and uncertainty there. He thought of Tommy, how the boy's eyes sparkled at new experiences, how much he needed joy in his life right now. "We'd be honored, ma'am," he said simply. The screen door creaked as Hank pushed it open, his tired muscles protesting after the long walk home. The modest house wasn't much, peeling paint, worn carpet, and furniture that had seen better days. But it was home. "Grandpa!" Tommy's excited voice rang out as the 8-year-old bounded down the narrow hallway. His dark hair was tousled, his sneakers untied, but his eyes sparkled with the pure joy only a child could muster. Hank managed to set down the grocery bags just in time to catch his grandson in a warm embrace. "Hey there, sport! Been good for your mama today?" Tommy nodded against his chest. "I did all my homework and everything." He pulled back, nose wrinkling. "Well, except for that one math problem. It was really hard." "We'll take a look at it after dinner," Hank promised, ruffling the boy's hair. His eyes drifted to the kitchen doorway where Lila sat at their small table, shoulders hunched over a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. She wore the same faded blue sweater as yesterday, her long brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "Hi, sweetie," Hank called out softly. Lila looked up briefly, managing a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes before returning her gaze to the coffee cup. Tommy helped carry the groceries to the kitchen, chattering about his day at school. Hank listened, making appropriate noises of interest while he unpacked the bags. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. "Mama, can I help make dinner?" Tommy asked, already pulling out a dented pot from the cabinet. Lila stirred, as if waking from a dream. "Oh, yes, of course." She stood slowly. Like every movement required intense concentration. "What did you get, Dad?" "Ground beef was on sale," Hank said, carefully arranging the items on the counter. "Thought we could have spaghetti tonight." He didn't mention how he'd waited an extra hour at the store for the marked-down meat, or how his back ached from standing so long. They worked together in the small kitchen, Tommy setting the table while Lila mechanically stirred the sauce. Hank watched them both, his heart heavy. There was a time when Lila's laugh had filled this house, when her eyes had sparkled just like Tommy's. Before her husband walked out, before the depression settled over her like a heavy blanket. As they sat down to eat, Tommy's fork clinked against his plate in the silence. Hank cleared his throat. "Met someone interesting today." Tommy perked up immediately. "Really? Who?" "A lady named Clara. Used to be a piano teacher." Hank twirled spaghetti around his fork. "She invited us to visit tomorrow afternoon. Said she'd play for us." "A real piano?" Tommy's eyes widened. "Like the one at church?" "Tommy, we couldn't impose," Lila began, but Hank gently cut her off. "It was her idea, sweetie. She seemed, well, like she could use some company." He watched his daughter's face carefully. "Reminded me a bit of Mrs. Reynolds, your old music teacher. Remember how you used to love those lessons?" Lila's hand trembled slightly as she set down her fork. "That was a long time ago, Dad." "Can we go, Mom, please?" Tommy bounced in his chair. "I've never heard a real piano up close before." "I don't know." Lila pushed her barely touched food around her plate. "We don't even know this woman, and I have things to do tomorrow." Hank knew those things meant sitting in the house, curtains drawn, fighting the darkness that seemed to follow her these days. "She's a kind soul," he said quietly. "Blind now, but still has that teacher's heart. Lives in that yellow house on Maple Street." "The one with the rose bushes?" Tommy asked excitedly. "I always wondered who lived there." A ghost of a smile touched Lila's lips. "You and your curiosity." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I suppose, if she really wants us to come." "Yes!" Tommy pumped his fist in the air, then quickly lowered it at his mother's look. "I mean, thank you, Mom." After dinner, Hank helped Tommy with his math homework while Lila washed dishes, the sound of running water and clinking plates filling the kitchen. When Tommy's eyes started drooping, Hank sent him off to bed with a hug and a kiss on the forehead. "Night, Grandpa," Tommy mumbled sleepily. "Tell me more about the piano lady tomorrow." "Sure thing, sport." Hank watched him shuffle down the hall, then turned to find Lila still at the sink, scrubbing the same pot she'd been working on for the past 10 minutes. "Sweetie," he said gently, "that pot's clean." Lila's hand stilled. "I know." She set it in the drying rack, her movements careful and precise. "Dad, are you sure about this? About tomorrow?" Hank stepped closer, wishing he knew how to bridge the gulf that had grown between them. "I think it might do us all some good." Tommy's so excited. And Clara, well, she's got a sort of gentleness about her. Reminds me of your mother that way. Lila's shoulders tensed at the mention of her mother, but she nodded slowly. "Okay. But if it doesn't? If I can't?" "Then we'll come home," Hank finished simply. No pressure. Later, lying in his narrow bed, Hank stared at the familiar cracks in the ceiling. The springs creaked as he shifted, trying to find a comfortable position. Through the thin walls, he could hear Tommy's soft breathing from the next room and the occasional rustle as Lila moved around in her bedroom downstairs. His mind wandered to Clara, standing so dignified at that crosswalk. There had been something in her voice when she played, a loneliness that echoed his own family's pain. Perhaps. But no, it wouldn't do to hope for too much. Still, he couldn't help remembering how Tommy's eyes had lit up at the mention of the piano, how even Lila had shown a flicker of interest. The bedside clock ticked steadily, marking time as Hank lay there, wondering what tomorrow might bring. Through his window, a sliver of moonlight cast patterns on the wall, dancing like piano keys in the darkness. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees as Hank and Tommy made their way down the quiet streets of their small town. Tommy skipped ahead, pausing every few steps to wait for his grandfather, his sneakers scuffing against the cracked sidewalk. "Is it much further, Grandpa?" Tommy asked, bouncing on his toes. Hank smiled, his worn work boots clicking steadily against the pavement. "Just around this corner, sport. See that yellow house with the rose bushes?" Tommy's eyes widened as they approached. The house stood like a gentle guardian of yesteryear, its weathered yellow paint peeling slightly at the edges. Despite signs of age, there was something undeniably charming about the two-story Victorian home. Rose bushes, their blooms mostly gone for the season, lined the brick pathway leading to a wide front porch. "It looks like a castle," Tommy whispered, clutching Hank's hand as they walked up the creaking porch steps. Hank squeezed his grandson's small fingers reassuringly. "Remember what I told you about Miss Clara being blind? We need to speak clearly so she knows where we are, okay?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "I remember." The brass doorbell chimed inside the house, its echo followed by the soft tap of a cane against hardwood floors. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Clara, her silver hair neatly pinned back, wearing a powder blue cardigan over a floral dress. "Hello?" she called out, her unseeing eyes directed slightly to their left. "Miss Clara? It's Hank, from yesterday. My grandson Tommy and I came to visit, like you invited us to." A warm smile spread across Clara's face. "Oh, yes. Please, please come in." She stepped back, gesturing with her free hand, "Mind the step at the threshold." They entered into a front parlor that seemed frozen in time. Heavy curtains filtered the afternoon sunlight, casting a soft glow over furniture draped with protective covers. The air held the slightly musty scent of a space that hadn't seen much life in recent years, but what caught Tommy's attention immediately was the grand piano that dominated one corner of the room. Its rich mahogany surface was dulled by a thin layer of dust, and scattered across its closed lid were yellowing sheets of music. "Would you like some tea?" Clara offered, her cane helping her navigate the familiar space. "I just made a fresh pot." "That's very kind of you," Hank said, watching as Tommy gravitated toward the piano. "Can Tommy look at your piano? He's never seen one up close before." Clara's face lit up. Of course. Please, Tommy, go ahead. It hasn't been played in far too long. Tommy approached the instrument with reverence, his small hand hovering over the covered keys. Can I open it? Here, let me help, Hank said, stepping forward to lift the heavy wooden cover that protected the keys. The ivory and ebony strips gleamed in the filtered light, somehow free of the dust that covered everything else. Tommy pressed one key tentatively, and a clear note rang through the room. His face broke into a delighted grin. "Grandpa, did you hear that?" Clara had made her way closer, guided by the sound. "Would you like to learn how to play something, Tommy?" Her voice held a slight tremor of emotion. "Really? You'd teach me?" Tommy looked up at her with wonder. "Here," Clara said, reaching out until her hands found Tommy's shoulders. She guided him to sit on the piano bench, then settled beside him. "Let me show you something my very first teacher taught me." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for Tommy's smaller ones. "First, we need to position your hands properly." With gentle touches, she shaped his fingers into the correct form over the keys. Music isn't just about pressing the right notes. It's about feeling the song in your heart. Hank watched from a few steps away, not wanting to interrupt the moment. Clara's face had transformed, years seeming to fall away as she guided Tommy's fingers to the correct keys. "Now, listen carefully," she instructed, playing a simple sequence of notes with her right hand. The melody was sweet and clear, like a spring morning. "Did you hear how those notes flow together? Try to play them back to me." Tommy's tongue poked out in concentration as he attempted to replicate the sequence. His first try was hesitant, missing a few notes, but Clara nodded encouragingly. "Very good. You have a natural ear for music. Let's try again, but this time I'll guide your hands." Clara placed her hands over Tommy's, her touch light but sure. Together, they pressed the keys in sequence, the melody filling the quiet house. Tommy's face shone with joy as the notes came out correctly. "I'm doing it!" he exclaimed. "Grandpa, are you watching?" "I sure am, sport," Hank replied, his voice thick with emotion. Something unexpected was swelling in his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. The sight of his grandson's happiness, combined with Clara's patient teaching, stirred memories of better days. "Now, let's add another note," Clara suggested, her fingers still resting lightly on Tommy's. "When we put these notes together, they tell a story." Under her guidance, Tommy played the expanded sequence. His small fingers grew more confident with each attempt, and soon his clear laugh rang out as he successfully completed the simple tune. "That's wonderful, Tommy," Clara praised, her own smile radiant. "You're a natural musician." The sound of Tommy's laughter echoed through the house, bouncing off the high ceilings and bringing life to rooms that had been silent for too long. Hank stood quietly, watching his grandson beam with pride at his accomplishment, while Clara sat straight-backed at the piano, her face glowing with the joy of teaching once again. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like silent notes, and in that moment, Hank felt an unexpected surge of pure joy warm his heart. It had been so long since he'd heard Tommy laugh like that, free and unrestrained, without the shadow of worry that so often clouded their home. The doorbell's chime echoed through Hank's modest home, making him look up from his morning coffee. Tommy raced to the front door, his footsteps thundering across the worn floorboards. "Hold on there, sport," Hank called out, pushing back his kitchen chair. "Let me get that." When he opened the door, Clara stood on their small concrete stoop, one hand gripping her white cane while the other carefully balanced a covered plate. She wore the same powder blue cardigan as yesterday, but today it was paired with a dark gray skirt that brushed her ankles. "I hope I'm not too early," she said, tilting her head toward the sound of their voices. "I brought chocolate chip cookies. They might be a bit crispy. It's been years since I've baked." "You didn't have to do that," Hank said, gently taking the plate from her hands. "Please, come in." "Tommy, help Miss Clara with the steps." Tommy eagerly reached for Clara's free hand. There are 2 steps, Miss Clara. The first one's kind of crooked. Clara's face softened at Tommy's careful guidance. Thank you, dear. You're quite the gentleman. Inside, the morning sun streamed through the living room's single window, highlighting the worn furniture and faded carpet. Hank had done his best to tidy up, but there was no hiding the shabby nature of their home. Still, it was clean and warm, filled with framed photos of Tommy and a few treasured family mementos. We have a small piano, Tommy announced proudly, leading Clara to the corner of the living room. It's not as fancy as yours, but Grandpa found it at a yard sale. The upright piano was indeed modest, its wood scratched and its ivory keys yellowed with age. But Hank had spent a weekend tuning it as best he could, hoping to give Tommy a chance to practice what Clara might teach him. Clara's fingers trailed over the piano's surface. This is wonderful, Tommy. Every piano has its own personality, you know. Shall we see what songs this one likes to sing? As Clara settled onto the piano bench with Tommy, Hank noticed movement in the hallway. Lila stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching with guarded curiosity. She'd been skeptical when Hank mentioned Clara was coming over, but something in her stance now seemed less defensive. Clara's fingers found the keys, and she played a simple melody. When I first started teaching, she said, her voice warm with memory, I had a little student just about your age, Tommy. He was so nervous his hands shook. But by the end of his first lesson, he was playing Mary Had a Little Lamb, like he'd known it all his life. Tommy watched intently as Clara demonstrated the basic finger positions. How many students did you teach, Miss Clara? Oh my, hundreds over the years. Clara smiled, adjusting Tommy's hand position slightly. Each one was special in their own way. There was Sarah, who always brought me wildflowers from her garden, and Michael, who struggled so much at first but ended up playing at Carnegie Hall years later. As Clara guided Tommy through simple exercises, her face grew more animated. She shared stories between instructions, tales of recitals and competitions, of shy students who blossomed through music, of the joy she found in teaching. With each story, her movements became more confident, as if the years of isolation were falling away. Music isn't just about getting the notes right, she explained, helping Tommy master a simple sequence. It's about feeling the emotion behind them. When you play a happy song, think about what makes you happiest. From the doorway, Lila made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. Hank glanced at his daughter, noting how her arms had uncrossed, her hands now clasped together as she watched her son. Exactly like that, Clara agreed. Now, try playing it again with that happy feeling. The notes rang out clearer this time, Tommy's small fingers moving with more purpose. Clara beamed with pride, and Hank noticed tears glistening in her unseeing eyes. I haven't felt this alive in years, Clara admitted softly, while Tommy practiced the sequence again. After I lost my sight, I thought my teaching days were over. I closed myself off, convinced I had nothing left to give. Hank pulled a kitchen chair closer, speaking gently. Seems to me you have plenty to give, Miss Clara. The morning passed quickly, filled with music and laughter. Even Lila eventually stepped into the room, settling quietly on the couch to watch. When Tommy successfully played a simple tune all the way through, her quiet, "Well done, sweetie," made him beam with pride. As the lesson wound down, Clara reached into her large purse and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in raised dots. This is Braille sheet music, she explained, running her fingers over the pages. I thought perhaps we could learn together, Tommy. Would you like that? Yes, please, Tommy exclaimed, carefully touching the raised dots. Can we have lessons every day? Clara laughed, but there was a hint of something else in her voice, a tremor of uncertainty. Well, perhaps we should start with once a week and see how it goes. As Tommy rushed off to show Lila his new music, Hank helped Clara gather her things. He noticed her hands shaking slightly as she folded her cane. Hank, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, I need to tell you something. She gripped her cane tighter. I I may not be able to continue the lessons for very long. Is everything all right? Clara's chin quivered. I received a notice last week. The property developer who bought the houses on either side of mine, he wants my house too. I've been fighting it, but... She swallowed hard. I can't afford the legal fees anymore. They're going to evict me soon. The shame and fear in her voice made Hank's heart ache. Here was a woman who had just brought such joy to his grandson, who had begun to emerge from her shell of isolation, facing the loss of her home. I haven't told anyone else, she continued, her voice trembling. I didn't want pity, but after today, after seeing Tommy's enthusiasm, I thought you should know why I might have to stop the lessons. The morning sun cast long shadows across Hank's small living room as he pushed the worn coffee table against the wall. Tommy darted around, straightening crooked picture frames and fluffing the threadbare cushions on the couch. Tommy, slow down, Hank chuckled. Miss Clara won't be here for another 15 minutes. But Grandpa, everything has to be perfect. Tommy insisted, now arranging his mother's magazines in a neat stack. A knock at the door made them both jump. Tommy rushed to answer it, but Hank gently held him back. Let me get it, sport. Clara stood on their narrow porch, holding a covered plate in one hand and her white cane in the other. She wore a powder blue dress that matched yesterday's cardigan, her silver hair caught up in a neat bun. I hope I'm not too early, she said, tilting her head toward the sound of their voices. I brought chocolate chip cookies. You didn't have to do that, Hank said, carefully taking the plate. Please come in. Watch your step. There's a small lip at the doorway. Tommy bounced on his toes. Did you really bring cookies, Miss Clara? Tommy, Hank warned softly, but Clara laughed. I certainly did, and I hope you'll share them with your mother, too. Clara's unseeing eyes crinkled at the corners. Is she home? She's in her room, Tommy said, his voice dropping slightly. She has headaches sometimes. Hank guided Clara to their old armchair, the best seat in the house. Can I get you some coffee or tea? Coffee would be lovely, thank you. Clara settled into the chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Now, Tommy, would you like to show me what you remember from yesterday? Tommy scrambled to the small electronic keyboard Hank had borrowed from their church. It wasn't much, just a basic model with weighted keys, but their pastor had been happy to loan it when Hank explained the situation. It's not as nice as your piano, Tommy apologized, switching it on. Any instrument played with love makes beautiful music, Clara assured him. She listened as Tommy picked out the simple melody she'd taught him, her head tilted slightly. Very good. You've been practicing. All morning, Hank confirmed from the kitchen, where he was preparing coffee. I think he wore out the batteries in his mother's radio playing along with songs. Clara's face lit up. You've been experimenting with other music? Tell me about that. As Tommy excitedly described his musical discoveries, Hank noticed movement in the hallway. Lila stood in the shadows, wearing her usual oversized sweater, watching the scene with cautious interest. Would you like some coffee, honey? Hank asked quietly. Lila shook her head but didn't retreat to her room. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Clara was now seated beside Tommy at the keyboard, her hands hovering over his. When I first started teaching, she said, I had a student about your age. He was so nervous, his hands would shake every time he touched the keys. What happened to him? Tommy asked. Well, by the end of that first year, he played in the town's Christmas concert. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from those who are afraid to begin. Clara's fingers guided Tommy's through a new sequence of notes. There was another student, a little girl, who could only practice at the library because her family couldn't afford a piano. She would spend hours there after school, playing on an old upright in the reference section. Did she become a famous pianist? Tommy's eyes were wide with wonder. Clara laughed softly. No, but she became a music teacher herself. Now she helps other children discover the joy of music. Her voice grew wistful. I had almost forgotten these stories. It's been so long since. She trailed off, but Hank understood. since losing her sight, since withdrawing from the world. From the hallway came the soft sound of footsteps. Lila had moved closer, drawn by Clara's stories and Tommy's evident enthusiasm. "Mom," Tommy called out, spotting her. "Come listen to what Miss Clara taught me." There was a moment of tension as Lila hesitated, but then she moved into the room. "I'd like that," she said quietly. Clara turned her head toward Lila's voice. "You must be Tommy's mother. He has a natural talent for music." "He gets that from his father," Lila said, then immediately stiffened, as if regretting the words. But Clara simply nodded. "Music has a way of connecting us to memories, both sweet and bitter. Sometimes playing can help us work through the hard feelings." Something in Lila's expression softened. She sank onto the couch, accepting the coffee Hank offered her. It was the first time in weeks she'd joined them in the living room during the day. The morning passed quickly as Clara guided Tommy through proper hand positions and basic music theory, explaining everything in ways his young mind could grasp. She taught him a simple duet, and soon their small house was filled with the sound of music and Tommy's delighted laughter. "I haven't had this much fun teaching in years," Clara admitted during a break, while Tommy devoured cookies in the kitchen. "I forgot how wonderful it feels to share music with an eager student." Hank noticed her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "Are you all right?" Clara's smile faltered. "Actually, Hank, there's something I should tell you." She lowered her voice. I'm not sure how many more lessons I can give Tommy." "Oh?" Hank settled into the chair beside her. "Is it too tiring?" No, nothing like that." Clara twisted her hands in her lap. "The truth is, I'm being evicted from my home." The word hung heavy in the air between them. Hank watched as Clara's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing the fear beneath. "A developer wants to buy the entire block," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Most of my neighbors have already sold. I've tried to hold out, but—" She swallowed hard. "I've lived in that house for 40 years. It's where I taught all my students, where I last saw my husband's face before he passed, her voice broke. "Where I last saw anything at all." Hank reached out instinctively, placing his weathered hand over her trembling ones. "When?" "The final notice came yesterday." "I have 30 days. Clara's shoulders slumped, the proud posture she'd maintained all morning crumbling under the weight of her confession. "I'm so ashamed. I shouldn't have started teaching Tommy when I knew. When I can't." From the kitchen came the sound of Tommy humming the duet they'd practiced, blissfully unaware of the adults' conversation. Lila had disappeared back to her room, but she'd left her empty coffee cup on the side table, a small sign of progress. Hank sat at his small kitchen table, the dim overhead light casting shadows across the wrinkled eviction notice. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but sleep felt impossible. He smoothed the paper with trembling hands, though he'd memorized every harsh word hours ago. Notice of termination of tenancy 30 days to vacate premises. His eyes burned as he read through the legal language again. The developer, Brighton Properties, had offered Clara a settlement that seemed generous on paper. But how could any amount make up for forcing someone from their home of 40 years? Especially someone who couldn't see, who knew every corner and step by memory alone. The ancient refrigerator hummed in the background. A sound that usually faded into white noise now seemed to mock him, reminding him of the repairman's warning that it wouldn't last another year. Just one more expense he couldn't afford. Hank pulled his worn leather wallet from his back pocket and opened it under the light. 3 crumpled dollar bills and a handful of receipts stared back at him. His next pension check wouldn't arrive for 2 weeks, and half of it was already promised to the landlord. "Dad?" Lila's soft voice startled him. She stood in the kitchen doorway wearing an old flannel robe, dark circles under her eyes. "It's late." "Couldn't sleep?" Hank admitted, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Did I wake you?" Lila shook her head and sat down, pulling her robe tighter. "I heard you getting up every few minutes." She glanced at the eviction notice. "You're worried about her." She's all alone, Lila. Hank's voice cracked. No family, no one to help her pack or find a new place. And with her blindness, Dad. Lila reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. I know you want to help. You always want to help everyone, but we can barely keep our own heads above water. Hank nodded, his throat tight. I know that. Lord knows I know that. Then why are you sitting here torturing yourself? Because. Hank struggled to find the words. Because sometimes doing nothing hurts worse than trying and failing. Lila withdrew her hand, her expression hardening slightly. Like when you emptied your savings to help Jack and me with the down payment on our house? The house he got in the divorce? That was different, was it? Lila's voice rose slightly before she caught herself, glancing toward Tommy's room. More quietly, she continued, You work yourself to the bone for everyone else, and where has it gotten you? Living in a rundown apartment, barely making ends meet. I'd do it again, Hank said firmly. You're my daughter. Tommy's my grandson. Family helps family. And Clara isn't family. Lila's words were gentle but firm. She's a nice lady who's in a terrible situation, but she's not your responsibility. The sound of small feet padding across linoleum interrupted them. Tommy appeared in his Superman pajamas, rubbing his eyes. Grandpa, Mom, why are you fighting? We're not fighting, sweetheart, Lila said quickly. Just talking. You should be in bed. Tommy ignored her, walking over to peer at the paper on the table. Is that about Miss Clara's house? Hank nodded, seeing no point in lying. Yes, buddy. She has to move out soon. But why? Tommy's face scrunched up in confusion. She loves her house, and her piano, and she's teaching me music. Sometimes, Lila began, but Tommy cut her off. We have to help her. You always say we should help people who need it, Grandpa. You helped Mrs. Rodriguez carry her groceries last week, and Mr. Peterson with his car, and— This is different, Tommy, Lila interrupted. This isn't about carrying groceries. It's about money and legal things, and— But Grandpa says doing the right thing is more important than money. Tommy's lower lip trembled. Miss Clara makes me happy. She makes you happy too, Mom. I saw you smiling today when she was telling stories. Lila fell silent, and Hank saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, perhaps, of how Clara had drawn her out of her shell, if only for a moment. Tommy's right about one thing, Hank said quietly. Clara brings light into people's lives. Into our lives. He looked at his daughter. When was the last time you sat in the living room with us for more than 5 minutes? Lila stared at her hands. That's not fair. Maybe not, Hank sighed. But it's true. Tommy climbed into his grandfather's lap, something he hadn't done in months. Please, Grandpa, we have to try. You always say God helps people who help others. That's not exactly, Lila began, but Hank held up his hand. Let me think on it overnight, he said. Right now, young man, you need to be in bed. After tucking Tommy back in, Hank returned to find Lila still at the kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice. I know that look, she said without looking up. You're going to try to help her, aren't you? I don't know what I can do, Hank admitted, but I have to try something. Even if it means putting us at risk? What if you get hurt helping her move, or spend money we don't have? Lila's voice cracked. I can't lose you too, Dad. Hank's heart ached at the fear in her voice. Oh, honey. He moved to embrace her, but she stood up abruptly. Just promise me you'll think about it. Really think about it. She hurried from the kitchen before he could respond. Later, kneeling beside his bed as he had every night for decades, Hank clasped his hands and bowed his head. The moonlight filtering through his threadbare curtains cast just enough light to see the worn Bible on his nightstand. Lord, he whispered, I don't know what to do. My heart says help, but my wallet says run. I've got my family to think about, but Clara, she's all alone. He paused, struggling with the words. I know you don't give us burdens we can't bear, but sometimes it's hard to know which path is right. Please, please, just show me what to do." The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of his uncertainty. On his nightstand, next to the Bible, lay his last pay stub from Odd Jobs, a reminder of both his limitations and his determination. The eviction notice sat beside it, Clara's predicament haunting him even here in the quiet darkness of his room. The morning sun cast long shadows across Clara's front yard as Hank made his way up the cracked sidewalk. His toolbox rattled with each step, the familiar weight somehow comforting in his calloused hands. The white picket fence that encircled Clara's property leaned precariously, its aging wood weathered by years of neglect. Hank knocked on the door, 3 gentle raps that echoed in the quiet morning air. After a moment, he heard the tap of Clara's white cane approaching. "Who is it?" Her voice carried a hint of apprehension. "It's Hank, Clara. Thought I might fix that fence of yours, if you'll let me." The door opened, revealing Clara in a powder blue sweater, her silver hair neatly pinned back. A smile softened her features. "Hank? But it's barely 8 o'clock. Early bird catches the worm," he said, then added quickly, "I brought some groceries, too. Nothing fancy, just bread, milk, eggs. Noticed your fridge was getting low yesterday." Clara's hand trembled slightly on her cane. "You shouldn't have. I mean, you've got your own family to worry about. Neighbors help neighbors," Hank said simply, setting his toolbox down with a clunk. "Besides, Tommy would never forgive me if I let his piano teacher go hungry." A chuckle escaped Clara's lips, and she stepped aside to let him in. In the kitchen, Hank put away the groceries, while Clara made coffee, moving with practiced ease around her familiar space. The routine felt natural, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of days. Over the next week, Hank fell into a pattern. He'd stop by Clara's house between odd jobs, fixing what needed fixing, a loose floorboard here, a squeaky hinge there. Clara always protested at first, but soon learned to accept his help with quiet gratitude. One afternoon, as Hank worked on replacing rotted fence posts, Clara brought him a glass of lemonade. She settled onto the porch steps, her unseeing eyes turned toward the sound of his hammer. "My Harold used to work in the yard," she said softly. "I'd know it was him by the way he hummed while he worked. Been 15 years since he passed, but sometimes I still listen for that humming." Hank paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "My Margaret. She used to say I was too quiet when I worked. Said it made her nervous, not knowing what I was up to." Clara smiled, her fingers tracing the condensation on her own glass. "Tell me about her?" "She was sunshine," Hank said, the words coming easier than he expected. "Always singing, always moving. Even at the end, when the cancer had her so weak, she'd still hum lullabies to Lila." "How old was Lila then?" 17. Hank drove another nail into the fence post, the sharp sound punctuating his words. "Too young to lose her mama. Sometimes I think that's why she fell so hard for Jack. He came along right when she needed someone to fill that empty space." Clara nodded slowly. "And now she's dealing with her own loss, in a way. Different kind, same pain." "Yeah," Hank's hammer stilled. "Guess we all carry our share of empty spaces." As the days turned into weeks, their conversations deepened. Clara spoke of the darkness that descended when she lost her sight. Not just the physical darkness, but the isolation that followed. How friends drifted away, uncomfortable with her condition. How she withdrew into herself, letting the music that once filled her home fall silent. "The piano was my life," she confided one evening as they sat in her living room. "Teaching, performing. It gave me purpose. When I couldn't see the keys anymore, I thought that purpose was gone. Silly, really. My fingers still knew the way." "Nothing silly about being scared," Hank replied, thinking of his own fears, of failing his family, of not being enough. Tommy's visits became regular events, his piano lessons filling Clara's house with music and laughter. The boy's natural talent blossomed under Clara's guidance, his small hands growing more confident on the keys. Even Lila began to join them occasionally, sitting quietly in the corner, but Hank noticed how the tension in her shoulders eased when Clara played. One particularly warm evening, as the sun began its descent, Hank and Clara sat on her front porch. The newly repaired fence gleamed with fresh white paint, a symbol of renewal against the backdrop of uncertainty. Through the open windows, Tommy's halting but determined practice of amazing grace drifted out to them. Clara's face glowed in the golden light. "You know," she said softly, "I spent years thinking I'd lost everything when I lost my sight. Pushed everyone away because I couldn't bear their pity." She paused, listening to Tommy's playing. "But you've given me more than sight ever could." The Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through Clara's bedroom window as she ran her fingers over her best dress. The fabric felt smooth and familiar, though she hadn't worn it in years. Her hands trembled slightly as she buttoned up the navy blue cotton dress, wondering if it still looked as nice as she remembered. A knock at her front door made her heart skip. "Coming!" she called, reaching for her white cane. She'd been practicing the path from her bedroom to the door all week, determined not to stumble in front of Hank and his family. "Good morning, Clara." Hank's warm voice greeted her. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush creep into her cheeks. "I wasn't sure about the dress. It's been so long since I've worn it." "It's perfect," Lila's voice chimed in, surprising Clara. "The color suits you, Miss Clara." Tommy's excited voice piped up. "I saved the back seat just for us." Clara felt Tommy's small hand slip into hers, and tears pricked at her eyes. It had been 5 years since she'd attended church, 5 years since she'd let fear and shame keep her isolated in her home. But now, with Tommy's eager tugging and Hank's steady presence beside her, the fear seemed smaller somehow. The short drive to church was filled with Tommy's chatter about the Sunday school lesson he'd prepared for. Clara found herself relaxing, letting his enthusiasm wash over her. The car slowed to a stop, and she heard the familiar crunch of gravel under the tires. "We're here," Hank announced, opening her door. The sound of church bells rang out across the morning air, and Clara's chest tightened with emotion. How many Sundays had she spent alone, listening to those same bells from her empty house? As they approached the church entrance, conversations around them hushed. Clara could feel the stares, hear the whispers of recognition. Her grip tightened on her cane. "Clara? Clara Morrison?" A woman's voice called out. "Is that really you? Martha?" Clara recognized the voice of her old friend from the church choir. "Yes, it's me." Suddenly she was surrounded by warm greetings and gentle touches. Old friends welcomed her back, their voices thick with emotion. Clara felt overwhelmed but grateful for Tommy's steady presence at her side, anchoring her in the flood of reunions. Inside the church, the familiar scent of wood polish and hymnals wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket. Tommy led her to a pew, describing in whispers where everything was located. "The piano's still in the same place," he informed her, "right up front, next to the pulpit." The service began with Pastor Robert's welcome, his voice exactly as Clara remembered it. As the congregation settled into the rhythm of worship, Clara felt decades of memories washing over her. Weddings, funerals, Christmas programs, all celebrated in this sacred space. After the second hymn, Pastor Roberts cleared his throat. "Brothers and sisters, we have a special blessing among us today. Clara Morrison has returned to our congregation." A murmur of agreement rippled through the church. "Clara, your music once filled these halls with such glory. Would you consider blessing us with a song today?" The request hung in the air like a held breath. Clara felt her pulse quicken, fear creeping up her spine. Play? In front of everyone? She hadn't performed in public since losing her sight. "You can do it, Miss Clara," Tommy whispered, squeezing her hand. "Just like when you play for me." Clara swallowed hard. Tommy's simple faith in her pushed back against years of self-doubt. She felt Hank's reassuring presence on her other side, steady and supportive as always. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I'll play." Tommy led her to the piano, describing the 3 steps up to the platform. Her fingers found the familiar keys, smooth and cool under her touch. The silence in the church was absolute as she settled onto the bench. For a moment, she sat still, gathering her courage. Then, softly at first, her fingers began to move across the keys. The opening notes of Amazing Grace filled the sanctuary. As she played, years of fear and isolation seemed to melt away. The music flowed through her, not just from memory, but from somewhere deeper, a place of healing and hope. She could hear sniffles from the congregation as she played, could feel the emotion building in the room. When she reached the final verse, her own tears fell freely. The last notes lingered in the air, a prayer of gratitude and redemption. The silence that followed was broken by Tommy's enthusiastic applause, quickly joined by the entire congregation. Clara felt hands patting her shoulders, heard voices thick with emotion thanking her. Martha from the choir hugged her tightly, whispering, "Welcome home." After the service, surrounded by old friends and new well-wishers, Clara felt lighter than she had in years. The fellowship hall buzzed with conversation and laughter, the scent of coffee and fresh-baked cookies filling the air. Tommy proudly introduced her to his Sunday school teachers as "my piano teacher," while Lila engaged in quiet conversations with church members she'd been avoiding since her husband left. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Hank drove Clara home. Tommy had fallen asleep in the back seat, worn out from the excitement of the day. When they pulled up to her house, Hank helped her to her door. Standing on her front porch, Clara turned to face Hank. "I never thought I'd play in public again," she said softly. "I was so afraid of making mistakes, of people pitying me. But today—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Today felt like being given a second chance at life." "You gave us all a gift today," Hank replied. "Reminded us what courage looks like." Clara smiled, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on her face. The darkness that had seemed so absolute for so long now felt less overwhelming, less final. She had found her way back to music, back to community, back to life itself, one small step at a time. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on the worn linoleum floor. Hank stood at the stove, methodically stirring a pot of oatmeal as he did every morning. But something was different today. A sound he hadn't heard in years filled the small kitchen. Lila was humming. He almost dropped the wooden spoon when he first heard it. The melody of Amazing Grace drifted softly from where she sat at the table, her fingers absently tapping the rhythm on her coffee mug. Her eyes held a distant, peaceful look he hadn't seen since before her husband left. That was something yesterday, wasn't it? Hank ventured carefully, not wanting to break the spell. "Clara playing at church?" Lila's humming paused, but her small smile remained. "It was beautiful, Dad. I'd forgotten how music could make you feel alive." She took another sip of coffee, then added, "Tommy couldn't stop talking about it before bed last night." As if summoned by his name, Tommy bounded into the kitchen, his hair still tousled from sleep. "Is Miss Clara coming today? She promised to teach me the new song." "After lunch, sport," Hank replied, ladling oatmeal into bowls. "She's bringing over some old sheet music she found." To his surprise, Lila stood up and walked to the cabinet where they kept the maple syrup. "I thought I might make some banana bread before she comes," she said, pulling out flour and measuring cups. "Remember how Mom used to make it?" Hank's throat tightened. It had been months since Lila had baked anything. Years, really, since she'd mentioned her mother without that edge of bitterness in her voice. "That would be nice," he managed. "Clara loves bananas." Throughout the morning, the house transformed. Lila tied on her mother's old apron and lost herself in the familiar motions of baking. The sweet smell of banana bread filled every room, mixing with the sound of Tommy practicing his scales on the small electronic keyboard Clara had lent him. When Clara arrived after lunch, she paused in the doorway, inhaling deeply. "Is that banana bread I smell?" "Lila made it," Tommy announced proudly, taking Clara's hand to guide her to her usual spot on the couch. "And I've been practicing really hard." "I can tell," Clara said warmly. "I could hear you playing as I walked up the sidewalk. Your rhythm is getting much better." Hank watched from his armchair as Tommy settled next to Clara at the keyboard. His grandson's face was serious with concentration as Clara's gentle hands guided his fingers over the keys, teaching him a simple melody. The boy who once spent hours in front of the television now begged for extra practice time. Later, while Tommy was showing Clara his progress, Lila brought out the fresh banana bread on their best serving plate. She'd even dug out the good teacups, wedding gifts that had stayed packed away since her husband left. "This is delicious," Clara exclaimed after her first bite. "It reminds me of something my mother used to make." "It was my mom's recipe," Lila said softly. "I haven't made it since." "Well, it's been a while." "Sometimes the best memories come back to us through the simplest things," Clara replied, her unseeing eyes gentle with understanding. "Like recipes. And music." Hank noticed Lila's hands trembling slightly as she poured more tea, but when Clara asked about the recipe, his daughter's voice grew stronger, sharing memories of baking with her mother that Hank hadn't heard her mention in years. The afternoon light softened into evening, and Tommy convinced Clara to play one more song before dinner. As her fingers moved across the keys, Hank watched his family. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, swaying slightly to the music. Lila had picked up her knitting, another hobby she'd abandoned years ago, her needles moving in rhythm with Clara's playing. The scene struck him suddenly. How natural it felt. How right. Clara's presence had brought something back to their home that went beyond music. She'd somehow helped them remember who they were before grief and abandonment had changed them. When Clara finished playing, Lila insisted she stay for dinner. "I'm making Mom's chicken and dumplings," she said. "I found her old recipe box this morning." "Oh, I couldn't impose," Clara started, but Tommy was already pleading. "Please, Miss Clara, Mom's cooking again, and everything tastes better than frozen dinners." Lila laughed, actually laughed, and the sound made Hank's heart swell. Well, with an endorsement like that, how can you refuse? During dinner, Hank found himself watching Clara, the way she smiled when Tommy told her about school, how she listened intently when Lila talked about maybe taking some evening classes at the community college, the gentle way she moved, despite her blindness, with a grace that spoke of inner strength. He realized he'd started looking forward to these moments, not just for what Clara gave his family, but for her company itself. The thought caught him off guard. Since losing his wife, he'd closed that part of his heart, focusing solely on helping Lila and Tommy survive their own loss. But now, watching Clara laugh at one of Tommy's jokes, her face lit with genuine joy, Hank felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Sarah passed. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. After dinner, as Hank walked Clara home in the cool evening air, Tommy's piano practice drifted from the open windows of their house. Clara tilted her head to listen, smiling. "He's going to be quite good, you know. He has a natural ear for it." "He has a good teacher," Hank replied. "We all do." Clara squeezed his arm gently. "Your family is healing, Hank. I see it happening day by day." "You've brought music back into our lives," he said. "Not just the piano kind." They reached her front porch, and Clara turned to face him. The setting sun caught her silver hair, creating a soft halo effect that made Hank's breath catch. "Thank you for walking me home," she said. "Thank you for everything," he responded, surprised by the emotion in his voice. As he walked back home, Hank could still feel the warmth of Clara's arm linked through his. The sensation brought both comfort and confusion. He hadn't expected to feel this way again, hadn't wanted to. But watching Clara with his family, experiencing the joy she brought into their lives, he couldn't deny the growing anticipation he felt each time she visited. The old church buzzed with activity, as volunteers arranged folding chairs in neat rows. Hank adjusted his tie, borrowed from the pastor, and watched Tommy pace nervously near the piano, his dress shoes clicking against the wooden floor. "What if I mess up, Grandpa?" Tommy whispered, tugging at his collar. Hank knelt beside him, straightening the boy's clip-on tie. "Remember what Clara says? Music comes from the heart, not just the fingers." In the front pew, Lila sat arranging programs she'd designed herself. "Concert for Clara," read the simple header, with a drawing of piano keys below. She'd spent hours at the library computer working on them, determined to make everything perfect. The benefit had started small, just an idea from the pastor's wife after hearing Clara play during Sunday service. But word spread through their small town, and now the church was filling with familiar faces. Even Mr. Peterson, who owned the hardware store where Hank sometimes worked odd jobs, had closed early to attend. Clara arrived, accompanied by Mrs. Jenkins from next door. She wore a deep blue dress that seemed to shimmer in the evening light, streaming through the stained glass windows. Her silver hair was swept up elegantly, and though her unseeing eyes couldn't take in the crowd, her face glowed with anticipation. "The piano's right where it always is," Hank said softly, taking her arm. "Tommy's been practicing all afternoon." "I know," Clara smiled. "I could hear him through my open windows." Such dedication in those small hands. As they walked toward the piano, Clara's cane tapping gently against the floor, people turned to watch. Many remembered her from years ago, when she'd taught their children or played for church events, before blindness had drawn her into isolation. Tommy bounced on his toes as Clara settled onto the piano bench, her fingers finding their familiar place on the keys. He sat beside her, small and determined in his Sunday best. "Ready, young man?" Clara asked. "Ready, Miss Clara." The pastor stepped to the podium, welcoming everyone and explaining the evening's purpose, but Hank barely heard the words. He watched Clara's face, seeing the years of loneliness fall away as she prepared to share her gift again. The first notes filled the church, clear and pure. Clara began with "Amazing Grace," her fingers moving with certainty born of decades of practice. Then halfway through, Tommy joined in, adding a simple harmony they'd rehearsed for weeks. His small hands moved carefully, guided by Clara's patient teaching and his own natural talent. Hank glanced at Lila, seeing tears glisten in her eyes. She reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. The music swelled, filling every corner of the sanctuary. Clara and Tommy moved together as if they'd played duets all their lives. When they finished, the silence held for a moment before applause erupted, but they weren't finished. Clara shifted into a classical piece, something Hank didn't recognize, but that made his heart ache with its beauty. Tommy watched her hands intently, waiting for his cue. When it came, he joined in perfectly, adding bright, hopeful notes that danced above Clara's deeper melody. In the audience, Mrs. Peterson dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. The baker's wife was openly crying. Even the stern-faced bank manager seemed moved, his usual frown softened by the music. They played for almost an hour, hymns and classical pieces, even a playful rendition of "Heart and Soul" that made everyone smile. Through it all, Clara's face shone with joy, while Tommy's concentration never wavered. For their final piece, Clara chose "What a Wonderful World." As the familiar melody filled the church, people spontaneously began to sing along. Their voices rose with the piano music, creating a moment of pure community that made Hank's chest tight with emotion. When the last note faded, the applause was thunderous. Tommy beamed, taking an enthusiastic bow as Clara had taught him. Clara smiled, her unseeing eyes bright with unshed tears. The pastor announced that donations could be left in the basket by the door, but people were already moving forward, pressing envelopes into his hands, insisting that Clara's music must be preserved, that her house must be saved. As the crowd mingled afterward over coffee and cookies in the fellowship hall, Clara sat quietly in a corner, her hands folded in her lap. Hank brought her a cup of tea, settling into the chair beside her. "You were magnificent," he said softly. "Both of you." "Did you see their faces?" she asked. "I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, feel their hearts opening. Everyone was moved. The pastor's wife is still crying." Clara's hand found his arm, her fingers trembling slightly. "I never thought I'd feel love again," she whispered. "After losing my sight, I thought that part of my life was over. But tonight," her voice caught, "tonight I felt surrounded by it." Hank covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of her fingers against his palm. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the happy chatter around them, to Tommy excitedly telling anyone who would listen about his piano lessons, to Leela laughing with old friends she'd withdrawn from months ago. The evening had brought more than just music back to their small town. It had reminded them all of the power of community, of reaching out, of opening hearts that had grown too cautious with hurt. But most of all, it had shown them that love could bloom in the most unexpected places, bringing light to the darkest corners of their lives. The morning sun cast long shadows across Clara's front porch as Hank climbed the worn steps, carrying fresh pastries from the bakery. His spirits were still high from last night's concert, the memory of music and community warming his heart. But his smile faded when he saw Clara sitting motionless in her rocking chair, clutching a piece of paper. "Clara?" He quickened his pace. "What's wrong?" She lifted her face toward his voice, and though her unseeing eyes couldn't meet his, he saw the devastation written across her features. "It came this morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The final notice." Hank set down the pastry box and gently took the paper from her trembling hands. The letter was printed on expensive letterhead, the kind that spoke of marble offices and mahogany desks. His eyes scanned the cold, formal language. "Final notice of eviction. Property acquisition proceeds as scheduled. Vacate within 30 days. "But the concert," Clara said, her fingers twisting in her lap. "All those donations." "We raised nearly $2,000, Hank confirmed, his throat tight. The generosity of their neighbors had seemed like such a victory last night. Now it felt painfully inadequate against the machinery of progress and profit. "The developer's offering 3 times what this place is worth," Clara continued. "But this house, it's all I have left. Every room holds memories of my students, my life before." She gestured vaguely at her eyes. Hank's jaw clenched as he read the signature at the bottom of the letter. Franklin Holdings, LLC. Something about it tugged at his memory, but he couldn't place it. "I'm going to City Hall," he declared, folding the notice carefully. "Maybe there's something we can do, some historical preservation law or—" Clara reached out, finding his arm with surprising accuracy. "Hank, you've already done so much." "I can't ask." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He covered her hand with his own. "Besides, Tommy would never forgive me if I let his piano teacher move away." That earned him a small smile, though it trembled at the edges. "I'll be back soon," he promised, already turning toward the steps. The walk to City Hall took him past familiar storefronts, most still closed this early. Mr. Peterson was setting up outside his hardware store, and he waved to Hank, probably still thinking about last night's concert. How quickly joy could turn to ashes, Hank thought. City Hall loomed ahead, its brick facade imposing despite its modest size. Hank had worked construction on the building's renovation 20 years ago, back when his knees didn't ache and his dreams were bigger. He climbed the steps, his work boots heavy on the polished floor. The clerk at the front desk directed him to the 3rd floor, where the developer was meeting with the city planner. Hank's anxiety grew with each step. He wasn't educated, wasn't used to confronting powerful people in suits. But the memory of Clara's face steeled his resolve. He found the right office and pushed open the door without knocking. 2 men in expensive suits looked up from a spread of blueprints. The younger one, the city planner, Hank didn't recognize, but the older man, Hank's heart stopped. Frank, his brother's face, lined now with age but still wearing that familiar smirk, registered first surprise, then amusement. "Well, if it isn't little brother Hank." Frank straightened, adjusting his silk tie. Still wearing those work boots, I see. 20 years of distance collapsed in an instant. Hank remembered the day Frank left town, sneering at their father's small business, declaring he was meant for bigger things. The arguments, the cruel words, the silence that followed. "You're the developer?" Hank's voice came out hoarse. "You're the one trying to force Clara out?" "Clara?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "Oh, the blind piano teacher. Didn't realize you knew her." He waved dismissively. "Business is business, Hank. That property is perfect for our new retail complex. The whole block, actually. She's lived there 40 years, Frank. It's her home. Home is wherever you can afford to live." Frank's smile turned cold. "Something you'd know about, judging by that shabby rental of yours." "Still playing the noble poor man, are you? How's that working out?" The city planner shifted uncomfortably, gathering his papers. "I'll give you two a moment," he muttered, slipping out the door. Hank stepped forward, his hands clenched. "The community raised money last night. We can make an offer." Frank's laugh cut him off. "Community? Please. This isn't some Hallmark movie, brother. This is reality, and in reality, money talks." He picked up a document from his desk. "Speaking of which, I'm offering the old lady 3 times market value. More than generous." "It's not about the money," Hank insisted. "That house is all she has left. Her music, her memories. Oh, spare me the sentiment." Frank's voice hardened. "You know what I remember, Hank. I remember you and Dad looking down on me for wanting more than this 2-bit town could offer. Well, look at us now. I've built something. What have you built? Besides calluses?" The words hit like physical blows, but Hank stood his ground. "I built a family. I raised a daughter. I help people who need it. And what has that gotten you? You can barely keep food on your table." Frank sat back in his leather chair. "Face it, brother, you backed the wrong horse. All your dignity and integrity, they don't amount to much when the bills come due, do they?" Hank felt the truth of it like a knife between his ribs. What could he offer Clara except empty promises? What could he do against his brother's wealth and power? "The eviction stands," Frank said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual business to conduct." Hank stood there a moment longer, looking at this stranger wearing his brother's face. Then he turned and walked out, his work boots echoing in the quiet hallway. The walk back to Clara's house felt like miles. Each step was heavy with defeat, with the bitter taste of helplessness. When he finally reached her porch, she was still in her rocking chair, her fingers moving as if playing an invisible piano. "Hank?" She turned toward his footsteps. "What did they say?" He sank into the chair beside her, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. "I can't save you," he whispered, the words burning his throat. "I'm so sorry, Clara. I can't save you." The week after Hank's confrontation with his brother dragged by like a funeral procession. Each morning, he walked past Clara's house on his way to work. And each morning, the curtains remained drawn, the porch empty, her rocking chair still and silent. The cheerful sounds of Tommy's piano lessons no longer drifted through the neighborhood. Instead, a heavy silence hung over the old house like a shroud. 3 times Hank knocked on her door. 3 times there was no answer. "She won't even come to the phone," Lila told him one evening, twisting the dish towel in her hands. "I tried calling again today." Her voice cracked. "She's just given up." Tommy sat at their small kitchen table, pushing his mac and cheese around his plate without eating. Dark circles shadowed his young eyes. He hadn't been sleeping well. "Why can't we help her, Dad?" he asked, looking up at Hank. "You always say we should help people who need it." The simple question hit Hank like a physical blow. He sank into his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. Sometimes wanting to help isn't enough, buddy. Sometimes the world is bigger than what we can fix." "That's not fair." Tommy's fork clattered against his plate. "Uncle Frank is mean. He's a bad person." "Tommy," Lila warned, but there was no real force behind it. She looked as angry as her son. "He is." Tommy insisted, tears welling in his eyes. Clara taught me piano and made cookies and helped Mom smile again. Why does he get to make her leave? Why does having money mean he can hurt people? Hank had no answer. The same questions had been eating at him all week, leaving him sleepless and hollow. He watched his grandson push away from the table and run to his room, the door slamming behind him. Lila's hands gripped the back of a kitchen chair until her knuckles went white. "I can't believe he's doing this," she said, her voice tight with rage. "Your own brother, treating people like they're nothing. Like their lives don't matter." She turned to Hank, eyes blazing. "Did you tell him about Tommy's lessons? About how much Clara means to us? He doesn't care." Hank said quietly. "To Frank, it's just business, numbers on a page. It's cruel, is what it is." Lila's voice broke. "After everything we've been through, Clara was helping us heal. Tommy was so happy learning piano. I was starting to feel—" She trailed off, wiping angrily at her eyes. "Starting to feel like yourself again?" Hank finished softly. Lila nodded, unable to speak. Hank understood. He'd seen his daughter coming back to life these past weeks, cooking again, humming along with Tommy's practice sessions, even talking about maybe going back to school. Now that light was dimming again, and he was powerless to stop it. Later that night, as Hank passed Tommy's room, he heard muffled sobbing through the door. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, then slowly pushed it open. Tommy lay curled on his bed, clutching the sheet music Clara had given him. "Hey, buddy," Hank said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Can't sleep?" Tommy shook his head, his face still buried in his pillow. "I miss her, Dad. I miss the lessons and her stories and—" He hiccuped. "What if we never see her again?" Hank's heart clenched. He reached out to stroke Tommy's hair, remembering how often he'd done the same when Tommy was smaller, when his father had first left. "I miss her too," he admitted. "You said—" Tommy sat up, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "You said God helps people who help others, so why isn't he helping Clara? She helps everyone." The question struck deep into Hank's core, touching his own doubts and fears. What kind of example was he setting for his grandson? What kind of man was he, if he couldn't protect the people he cared about? First his wife, then his daughter's marriage, and now Clara. It felt like everything he touched eventually crumbled. "Sometimes," Hank began, then stopped, realizing he had no wise words to offer, only questions. He sat with Tommy until the boy finally fell into an exhausted sleep, then made his way to his own small bedroom at the back of the house. The moon cast weak light through his window, illuminating the worn carpet and the water stain on the ceiling. In the quiet darkness, all his failures seemed to press in around him. Slowly, Hank sank to his knees beside his bed, the way he used to do with his wife each night before sleep. His hands clasped together, trembling slightly. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't understand. I've tried to live right, to help where I could. But I'm just a poor man. My own brother showed me that today, showed me how little all my trying matters in this world." Tears burned behind his closed eyes. "Clara needs more than I can give. My family needs more than I can give. I'm not enough, Lord. I've never been enough." His voice cracked. "Please, please give me strength. Show me how to help them. Show me how to be the man they need me to be." The silence that followed felt heavy with all his doubts and fears. Hank remained on his knees, his prayer becoming wordless, desperate. Somewhere in the night, he heard Tommy crying again, and Lila's soft footsteps going to comfort him. The sound of their pain was almost more than he could bear. "Please," he whispered one final time into the darkness, "please help me find a way." The morning sun crept through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the breakfast table. Hank sat alone, his coffee growing cold, staring at the worn tablecloth as if it held answers to questions he couldn't voice. The house was quiet. Tommy had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep after his nightmares, and Hank didn't have the heart to wake him for school. The sound of Lila's footsteps on the stairs broke the silence. She appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work at the diner, her face showing the strain of another sleepless night. But there was something else in her expression, a determination he hadn't seen in years. "Dad," she said softly, pulling out a chair, "we need to talk." Hank nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The weight of his failure pressed down on him like a physical thing. "Do you remember," Lila began, her voice steady, "what you used to tell me when I was little, when things got hard after Mom died?" Hank's throat tightened at the mention of his late wife. He remained silent. "You told me that faith wasn't just about believing things would get better," Lila continued. "It was about doing something to make them better." She reached across the table, covering his weathered hand with hers. "You taught me that God gives us strength not just to endure, but to act." "That was," Hank's voice cracked. "That was different. I was younger then. Stronger." "No." Lila's tone grew firm. "It wasn't different at all. When Mom died, everyone told you to put me in foster care. Said a factory worker couldn't raise a daughter alone. But you fought for me. You worked 2 jobs, learned to braid my hair, came to every school play, even when you were dead on your feet." Memories flooded back, midnight fevers, scraped knees, homework at the kitchen table. All those years of stretching pennies, of choosing between paying bills and buying school supplies. But they'd made it through. "And when Tom left me," Lila continued, her voice catching slightly, "you didn't let me give up. You held this family together. You showed Tommy what real strength looks like, not money or power, but love and determination." "But Clara," Hank started. "Clara needs that same strength now," Lila interrupted. "She needs the man who taught me to never back down when something matters. The man who showed me that being poor doesn't make you powerless." Something stirred in Hank's chest, a familiar ember of determination he thought had died. "Yesterday," Lila went on, "Tommy asked me why we can't help Clara. I didn't have an answer. But then I remembered something else you taught me. That one voice might seem small, but it can inspire others to speak up too." She squeezed his hand tighter. "You've spent your whole life helping others, Dad. The neighbors know it, the church knows it, even that grumpy Mr. Peterson whose roof you fixed last winter knows it. Maybe it's time to ask for their help in return." Hank finally looked up, meeting his daughter's eyes. They were bright with tears, but also with a fierce pride that reminded him so much of her mother. "When did you get so wise?" he asked softly. A small smile touched Lila's lips. "I had a good teacher." The kitchen fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged with possibility rather than defeat. Outside, birds began their morning songs, and somewhere down the street, a car started. "You know what else you taught me?" Lila asked, standing up. "That doing the right thing is hardly ever easy, but that's exactly why it matters so much." The words hit home, striking that ember in Hank's chest until it burst into flame. He thought of Clara's gentle hands guiding Tommy at the piano, of her courage in playing at church, of the way she'd brought music and joy back into their lives. He thought of all the other lives she'd touched in her years of teaching, all the beauty she'd created in this town. Slowly, Hank pushed back his chair and stood. His voice, when it came, was strong and clear. "Then we'll fight for Clara together." The words seemed to fill the kitchen, pushing back the shadows of doubt. Lila's face broke into a real smile, the kind he hadn't seen since before her husband left. "Together," she repeated. And in that moment, Hank saw not just his daughter, but his partner in whatever battle lay ahead. The early morning mist still clung to the streets as Hank stood on Miss Peterson's front porch, his heart hammering. He'd already knocked on 3 doors, and each time his voice had grown a little stronger, his purpose a little clearer. Now, as the elderly woman opened her door, surprise crossing her weathered face, he took a deep breath. "Hank? What brings you here at this hour?" "I need your help, Martha," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "It's about Clara Bennett." "Mrs." Peterson's expression softened at the name. "Clara? I remember when she taught my Sarah piano. That woman had the patience of a saint." She opened the door wider. "Come in. Tell me what's wrong." Inside her cozy living room, Hank told Clara's story, about the eviction notice, about his brother Frank's development plans, about how music had returned to her life through Tommy. Mrs. Peterson listened intently, her hands clasped in her lap. "That house has been in her family for generations, Mrs. Peterson said when he finished. "My mother used to tell me about taking lessons there too. We can't let them tear it down." She reached for her phone. "Let me call the garden club. We meet today, and every one of those ladies either took lessons from Clara or had children who did." By mid-morning, Hank had visited 6 more houses. At each one, the response was the same. Memories of Clara's kindness, her patience, the way she'd touched lives through her music. Mr. Johnson, the retired postman, remembered delivering mail to her house for 30 years, how she always had a kind word even on the worst days. The Ramirez family spoke of how she'd taught their 3 children, never charging extra when money was tight. At the diner where Lila worked, customers overheard Hank talking to the owner. Soon a petition was circulating among the breakfast crowd. Sarah, the waitress, placed a jar by the register with a hand-drawn sign, "Save Clara's Music House." By noon, the news had spread through the small town like wildfire. The hardware store owner, remembering how Clara had taught his grandson last year before losing her sight, offered to donate materials to repair her house. The local newspaper editor, whose sister had been one of Clara's first students, promised to run a story. At the church, Pastor Mike called an emergency meeting of the council. "Clara's house isn't just a building," he told them. "It's part of our town's heart. How many of us learned to love music within those walls?" Volunteers began organizing. The women's auxiliary group planned a bake sale. The youth group offered to clean up Clara's yard and paint her fence. Even gruff old Mr. Henderson, who rarely left his house anymore, wrote a check and pressed it into Hank's hand. "For piano lessons I never paid enough for," he grumbled. But his eyes were suspiciously bright. As the sun began to set, Hank made his way to Clara's house. His feet ached from walking all day, but his heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. He found her sitting in her familiar spot by the piano, her fingers tracing the keys without pressing them. "Clara," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned her face toward his voice. "Hank?" I thought perhaps you wouldn't come anymore." "I've been busy today," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Talking to people about you, about this house." "Please," she whispered, her hands dropping to her lap. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sometimes we just have to accept when things end." "No," Hank said firmly. "Not this time." He reached for her hand, encouraged when she didn't pull away. "You don't know what I've seen today. The whole town is rallying around you, Clara. Mrs. Peterson and the garden club, the church council, even old Mr. Henderson. But why would they? Because you matter to them. Because this house, your music, the kindness you've shown, it's all part of what makes this town home." His voice grew gentle. "You're not alone in this fight, Clara." Not anymore. She sat very still, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I've been alone for so long," she whispered. "Since losing my sight, I thought that was all there was left for me." "I know," Hank said. "I felt the same way after losing my wife. But sometimes God sends us reminders that we're still connected, still part of something bigger than ourselves." Clara's fingers tightened around his. "Tell me," she said softly. "Tell me what the town is doing." So Hank told her about the petition, the donations, the plans being made. He described how faces had lit up at the mention of her name, how stories of her kindness had spread from person to person. As he spoke, he felt her hand grow warmer in his, sensed hope flickering back to life between them. When he finished, Clara sat quietly for a moment. Then, with her free hand, she reached out and pressed a single piano key. The note rang clear and true in the evening air. "Perhaps," she said, her voice stronger now, "we could go to some of these meetings tomorrow? I think I'd like to thank people personally." "Of course," Hank replied. Their clasped hands rested on the piano bench between them, a bridge between despair and hope, between isolation and community. Through the window, the last rays of sunset painted the room in warm gold, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. The town hall's wooden benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town packed into the small space. Every seat was taken, with people standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The local newspaper photographer's camera flashed occasionally, capturing the historic turnout. At the front of the room, Frank sat at a long table with his lawyers, his expensive suit and confident smirk a stark contrast to the working-class crowd. Clara sat in the front row between Lila and Tommy, her white cane resting across her lap. Her fingers nervously traced its handle as the murmur of voices filled the stuffy room. Hank stood near the back, tugging at his worn collar, his prepared speech feeling like lead in his pocket. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. Tonight's emergency session will address the proposed demolition of 423 Maple Street, the Bennett property, and the community petition to designate it as a heritage site. Frank leaned forward to whisper something to his lawyer, both chuckling quietly. The sound made Hank's jaw clench. First, we'll hear from Franklin Morris, representing Morris Development Corporation. Frank stood smoothly, adjusting his tie as he approached the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, while I appreciate the sentimental attachment some may have to this property, the fact remains that progress cannot be stopped. Our development will bring jobs, tax revenue, and modern amenities to this struggling town. One old house, frankly in disrepair, should not stand in the way of community advancement. He continued for several minutes, his voice practiced and professional, laying out economic projections and property values. Some council members nodded along, making notes. "Thank you, Mr. Morris," Mayor Thompson said when Frank finished. "Now, we'll hear from Henry Morris, representing the community petition." Hank's legs felt like lead as he made his way to the podium. He pulled out his crumpled speech with trembling hands, then looked up at the sea of familiar faces. There was Mrs. Peterson, who'd brought him soup when his wife died. Mr. Johnson, who'd hired him to paint his fence last summer despite being able to do it himself. The Ramirez family, all 5 of them wearing their Sunday best. He tucked the speech back into his pocket. "I'm not good at fancy words," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "My brother Frank there, he's always been better at that. But I know something about value that you can't put in a spreadsheet." The room grew still. Even Frank's smirk faltered slightly. 3 months ago, my grandson Tommy was a quiet boy who'd stopped smiling. My daughter Lila was lost in grief after her husband left. And me? Hank's voice cracked. I was just trying to keep us all together on a handyman's wages and too much pride to ask for help. He gripped the podium edges. Then I met Clara Bennett. She was standing at that busy intersection by the market, looking lost and helping her across that street. Well, it led us all across to something better. Hank described the first time Tommy played piano under Clara's guidance, how the music had brought light back into their home. He told them about the church performance, about Clara's gift for teaching by touch alone. His voice grew stronger as he spoke about the countless stories he'd heard while going door to door. 3 generations of children taught patience and perseverance at that piano. Clara's kindness to families who couldn't afford lessons, the Christmas recitals that brought the community together. That house isn't just Clara's home, Hank said, looking directly at his brother now. It's where this town's children learned to love music, where grieving widows found comfort in afternoon tea and gentle conversation, where my own family remembered how to hope again. Mrs. Peterson stood up suddenly, her voice clear and strong. My Sarah learned piano there. She plays at Carnegie Hall now. My boys all took lessons, Mr. Ramirez called out. First time they ever felt proud of themselves. One by one, people began standing, sharing their own memories of Clara's house. The mayor had to rap his gavel several times to restore order. The property's value isn't in its walls or windows, Hank continued when the room quieted. It's in the love and music that's lived there for generations. You can't put a price on that kind of legacy. He turned to the council members. Clara's house isn't just a building. It's the heart of what makes us a community. And if we let it be torn down for profit, we'll be tearing down a piece of our town's soul. The silence that followed felt electric. Frank's face had turned an ugly shade of red. Several council members were wiping their eyes. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. Thank you, Mr. Morris. We'll now proceed to the vote on designating 423 Maple Street as a protected heritage site under Town Ordinance 47B. The council members conferred quietly. Paper ballots were passed, marked, and collected. The mayor counted them slowly, his expression carefully neutral. By a vote of 6-1, he announced, the Bennett property at 423 Maple Street is hereby designated a protected historical site to be preserved under the town's Heritage Protection Act. The room erupted in cheers. Tommy launched himself into Clara's arms as Lila hugged them both, crying. People surged forward to congratulate them. Frank stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. His face twisted with fury as he gathered his papers, shoved them into his briefcase, and stormed toward the exit. The heavy door slammed behind him, but hardly anyone noticed. They were too busy celebrating. Mrs. Peterson was already organizing a cleanup committee. The hardware store owner was listing repairs he'd donate. Through it all, Clara sat with tears streaming down her face, holding Tommy's hand and whispering, "Thank you," over and over. The celebration at Town Hall gradually spilled out onto the street as people headed home, their voices carrying through the cool evening air. Hank stood on the building's steps, watching Clara and his family climb into Mrs. Peterson's car for a ride home. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty parking lot, and the autumn wind rustled through the trees lining Main Street. He was about to head home himself when he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy, familiar footsteps he'd known since childhood. You just couldn't help yourself, could you? Frank's voice was sharp with bitterness. Had to be the town hero. Hank turned slowly to face his brother. Frank's expensive suit was rumpled now, his tie loosened, and his usually perfect hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. The smell of whiskey hung in the air between them. That wasn't what this was about, Frank, Hank said quietly. You know that. Frank barked out a harsh laugh. Oh, I know exactly what this was about. Same thing it's always been about. Saint Hank, the good son, the moral compass, showing everyone what a horrible person his brother is. I never said, you didn't have to. Frank's voice echoed off the brick buildings. You've been doing it our whole lives. Staying here, taking care of Mom and Dad, while I went off to make something of myself. Making me look like the bad guy for wanting more than this nothing town. The words hit Hank like physical blows, but he kept his voice steady. Is that what you really think? That I stayed to make you look bad? Didn't you? Frank stepped closer, his face twisted with decades of resentment. Perfect Hank, who never wanted anything more than to be a factory worker. Who married his high school sweetheart and lived in the same house our whole lives? Who made Mom and Dad so proud by just existing? You think I was perfect? Now it was Hank's turn to laugh, though the sound held more pain than humor. I worked 60-hour weeks and could barely keep food on the table. I watched my wife die of cancer because we couldn't afford better treatment. My daughter's husband abandoned her, and some days I can barely look her in the eye because I feel like I failed her. Frank faltered slightly, but the anger still burned in his eyes. At least you had a family, a wife who loved you, kids who looked up to you. And you could have had that too. Hank's voice rose for the first time. But you were so busy chasing money and status that you pushed away anyone who tried to get close. Remember Sarah Mitchell? She loved you, Frank, really loved you. But you broke it off because her family wasn't successful enough. Frank's face paled at the name. That was different. I had ambitions. And where did those ambitions get you? Hank gestured at his brother's expensive suit, his designer watch. You're rich, sure, but are you happy? Do you have anyone to share it with? I have respect. Frank shot back, but his voice wavered. I have power. People look up to me. People fear you, Hank corrected gently. There's a difference. The fight seemed to drain out of Frank suddenly. He slumped against the railing, looking older than his years. Why didn't you ever hate me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. All these years, I've given you every reason to, but you never did. Hank moved to stand beside his brother, their shoulders almost touching. Because you're my brother, Frank. That never changed. Even when I missed Mom's funeral? Even then. Even now, when I tried to kick that old woman out of her home? Even now. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching their breath fog in the cool air. Finally, Frank spoke again, his voice rough with emotion. I didn't know, about your wife's cancer, about Lila's husband leaving. He rubbed his face with both hands. I should have known, should have been here. You still can be. Hank said softly, It's not too late. Frank turned to look at his brother, really look at him for the first time in years. He saw the gray in Hank's hair, the lines around his eyes, the worn spots on his jacket. But he also saw the quiet strength there, the peace that had always eluded Frank despite all his wealth. Tommy's a good kid, Frank said hesitantly. And that Clara, she really did something special for them, didn't she? Hank nodded. She showed us that sometimes the best things in life can't be bought or sold. Frank was quiet for another moment, then straightened up. He extended his hand toward Hank, who looked at it in surprise. Maybe, Frank said, his voice gruff with emotion, you were the richer one all along. Hank took his brother's hand, and for the first time in decades, they shared a real handshake, filled with unspoken understanding and the possibility of healing. The morning sun filtered through Clara's bedroom window, its warmth gentle on her face. She stirred at the sound of voices and laughter drifting up from outside, unfamiliar yet welcoming sounds that had been absent from her home for so long. Miss Clara? Mrs. Peterson's cheerful voice called from downstairs. Are you awake, dear? There are quite a few people here who'd like to help fix up your house. Clara sat up slowly, her fingers trailing over her bedside table to find her robe. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way carefully down the hallway she knew by heart. The house smelled different, like fresh coffee and paint. Coming, she called, navigating the stairs with practiced ease. The moment she reached the bottom step, the sounds hit her full-force ladders scraping against walls, paintbrushes swishing, people chattering happily. The front door stood open, letting in the crisp morning breeze. Good morning, Clara. Hank's warm voice came from nearby. Hope we didn't wake you too early. The whole town showed up to help. The whole town? Clara's voice quavered slightly. Well, feels like it, Hank chuckled. Mr. Johnson from the hardware store donated paint. The Ladies' Aid Society is organizing a deep clean. Even Frank, my brother, sent over a crew to fix that leaky roof. Clara's hand found Hank's arm, squeezing it gently. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Hank replied softly. Just listen. And listen she did. Children's footsteps pattered across her porch. Someone was humming while they worked. The smell of fresh paint mingled with coffee and the cinnamon rolls Mrs. Peterson had brought. Miss Clara! Tommy's excited voice rang out. Can I show you what I practiced? Clara smiled, turning toward his voice. Of course, sweetheart. Lead the way to the piano. As Tommy guided her to the familiar bench, Clara heard the workers pause, their brushes and tools falling quiet. Her fingers found the keys smooth, cool, recently polished by loving hands. Tommy sat beside her, his small shoulder pressed against hers. The first notes of Morning Has Broken filled the house, Tommy's young fingers finding the melody, while Clara's hands provided the harmony. The music swelled, dancing through rooms that had been silent for too long. When they finished, applause erupted from every corner of the house. Clara felt tears on her cheeks, but they were different from the lonely tears she'd shed for so many years. Miss Clara? A small voice she didn't recognize spoke up. Could you teach me to play like that too?" "Me too," another child called out. "And me." Clara's heart swelled. "I would love to teach all of you." The days that followed brought new life to Clara's home. Every afternoon, children gathered around her piano, their eager hands learning to coax music from the keys. Their laughter echoed through halls that now smelled of lemon polish and fresh paint. Lila started coming by to help organize the lessons, her voice growing stronger and more confident each day. One afternoon, Clara overheard her on the phone, inquiring about teaching positions at the elementary school. "I forgot who I was," Lila confided to Clara later, as they sat drinking tea in the kitchen. "Watching you start over, it made me remember the dreams I used to have." "Sometimes," Clara replied, reaching across the table to pat Lila's hand, "we need others to light the way back to ourselves." Tommy's talent bloomed under Clara's guidance. His natural ear for music, combined with her patient teaching, produced melodies that drew neighbors to their windows when he practiced. But more than his musical ability, it was his joy that transformed the house, his footsteps racing up the porch steps each day, his excited voice calling out new songs he wanted to learn. The evenings belonged to Hank and Clara. After the last student left and Tommy had gone home to dinner, they would sit together on her newly repaired porch swing. Sometimes they talked, sharing stories of their lives. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, listening to crickets and distant church bells. "Do you remember that first day?" Clara asked one evening, the swing creaking gently beneath them. "When you helped me cross the street?" "Of course," Hank replied. His hand found hers, rough palm against soft fingers. "I was so lost then," she said quietly. "Not just at that crossing, but in life. I thought losing my sight meant losing everything that mattered." The swing swayed in the evening breeze. Somewhere nearby, a mockingbird sang its evening song. "And now?" Hank's voice was gentle. Clara turned her face toward him, smiling. "Now I see things I never saw before. I see kindness in the touch of a hand. I see love in the sound of children laughing. I see hope in the music we make together." She squeezed his hand. "For the first time in years, I feel I can truly see." The late afternoon sun painted golden streaks through Clara's living room windows, casting a warm glow over the gathering of neighbors and friends. The house hummed with life conversations drifted from every corner, plates clinked in the kitchen, and children darted between clusters of adults, their laughter echoing off freshly painted walls. Clara's home had transformed over the past month. New curtains danced in the breeze from open windows, and vases of fresh flowers dotted side tables. The grand piano, once covered in dust, now gleamed in the sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the faces of those who gathered around it. Lila moved through the crowd with a confidence that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. She carried a tray of lemonade, stopping to chat with neighbors who had become friends. Her smile, once rare, now came easily as she shared stories about her upcoming interview at the elementary school. Tommy bounced on his toes near the piano, barely containing his excitement as he waited for Clara. He wore his best shirt pressed specially for the occasion, and his hair had been carefully combed, though one stubborn cowlick refused to stay in place. "Patience, young man," Mrs. Peterson chuckled, ruffling his hair as she passed. "Your turn at the piano's coming soon enough." The room gradually quieted as Clara made her way to the piano, her hand resting lightly on Hank's arm. She wore a pale blue dress that brought out the silver in her hair, and a delicate brooch, a gift from Hank, sparkled at her collar. Though she couldn't see the admiring glances, she could feel the warmth of the gathering. "Ready, Tommy?" Clara asked, settling onto the piano bench. The boy scrambled up beside her, wiggling until he found just the right position. Hank stood close by, his weathered hands clasped together, watching as his grandson's small fingers hovered over the keys beside Clara's elegant ones. Lila joined him, slipping her arm through his, her head resting against his shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tommy announced with all the gravity an 8-year-old could muster, Miss Clara and I would like to play something special." A ripple of appreciative chuckles moved through the crowd. Clara's fingers found the opening chord, and Tommy followed her lead. The first notes of Amazing Grace filled the room, but this was no simple rendition. Clara had arranged it specially for four hands, weaving Tommy's simpler melody line through her own complex harmonies. The music swelled, and Hank felt tears gathering in his eyes. He remembered that first day, watching Tommy touch these keys with uncertain fingers. Now his grandson played with confidence, his face intense with concentration, but glowing with joy. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The pastor nodded in rhythm, his eyes closed. Even Frank, standing near the back of the room, seemed moved, his usual stern expression softened by the music. Clara's hands danced across the keys, adding flourishes that made the familiar hymn soar. Tommy kept pace perfectly, his part simple but essential to the whole. Together, they created something beautiful, just as they all had created something beautiful in these past months, turning isolation into family, despair into hope. Lila squeezed her father's arm gently. She knew what he was thinking about, all the nights he'd worked extra shifts, all the meals he'd stretched to feed them, all the times he'd held their family together with nothing but faith and determination. Now here they were, surrounded by love and music. The song built to its final verse. Clara and Tommy's hands moved in perfect synchronization, the notes rising and falling like prayers. The last chord hung in the air, sweet and pure, before fading into appreciative silence. Applause burst through the room. Tommy beamed, accepting the praise with a slight bow, just as Clara had taught him. "Did you hear it, Grandpa? Did you hear how we did the ending?" "I sure did, buddy," Hank said, his voice rough with emotion. "You played it beautifully." People began to drift toward the kitchen, where more refreshments waited, their conversations a pleasant murmur. Tommy hopped down from the bench, distracted by the promise of Mrs. Peterson's famous chocolate chip cookies. Hank moved closer to the piano, where Clara still sat, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. Lila gave his arm a knowing squeeze before following Tommy to make sure he didn't overwhelm himself with sweets. "May I?" Hank asked softly, gesturing to the space beside Clara on the bench. "Always," she replied, moving slightly to make room. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the happy sounds of their friends and family. The afternoon light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them to floating gold. Clara's hand found Hank's where it rested on the bench between them. Her touch was gentle, familiar now after so many shared moments. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, meant for his ears alone. "I thought I lost sight years ago," she said, her fingers intertwining with his, "but with you, Hank, I see love brighter than ever." Hank squeezed her hand in response, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Around them, their home for it had become their home now, in all the ways that mattered rang with music, family, and faith. Tommy's laughter carried from the kitchen, followed by Lila's gentle admonishment about one cookie at a time. Mrs. Peterson started another hymn somewhere in the background, other voices joining in. The old house seemed to embrace it all, its walls now holding not memories of loneliness, but the warm echoes of love and belonging. If you enjoyed the story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.